So welcome everybody. I just want to thank you for coming. Very excited to have Meridith Kimmerle with us. Meridith is a grief counselor who works in school districts in the metro area. So works with kids on grief. So I just want to remind everybody to mute on your end if you can. And I invite you to think about questions as she speaks, and at the end, she's going to have a little Q&A time. Also want to thank Jody Brognes Sheldon for introducing us to Meridith. If you weren't on earlier, they're neighbors and friends, and so really helpful to shepherd. So with that, welcome Meridith, and thank you so very much.
No, it's my pleasure. It's my pleasure. So I wanted to start off, and I can say if anybody has questions as I'm speaking, please don't hesitate to ask, because sometimes they might get lost by the end, and I'm fine. It doesn't throw me off to stop and address anything as I'm going over it. But what would help me is to know just what is the cross section I'm speaking to tonight. Do we have parents, grandparents, child professionals, all of the above on this call?
All of the above.
Yeah.
Okay. So we have some teachers. I was hearing something about Hopkins School District, so I'm imagining we have some teachers as well.
Yep.
Awesome. Well, and some students too.
Right.
So some of these students, if they go to any of the metro area schools, may have heard of the grief groups that happen in their schools as well for their classmates that are experiencing grief. So to start off, what the population I work with are kindergarten through 12th grade, and most of the students that I work with have had a parent or a sibling that have died. Sometimes it's a primary caregiver if there's another adult figure in their life that is providing that service. And then on other cases, if there's a classmate who dies, I will go in and help facilitate grief support for them as well. And now my keyboard doesn't want to respond to me. So let's see if we can make that work. Okay, there we go. So during this time in our society, there's a lot of discussion and increased awareness about mental health and the needs for our children and teens. The lack of understanding and the impact that death has on children and teens has led to neglect of addressing this issue. It's our duty to understand this to the best of our ability so that we can really combat all the different side effects that come along with grief in our young population. So what is grief? Grief's a collection of all the feelings we have when someone we care about dies. So we might take for granted what grief means, but working with the younger populations, I really like to boil it down and have them tell me what feelings they have when grief comes up. And they get confused sometimes when I say, obviously it can be sad and mad, angry, frustrated, confused, but that relief can play a role in there depending on what the story is as well. And oftentimes that's when kids are questioning, well, does that mean that I'm happy that someone died? No, it's not that they're happy. It might be that you're relieved that that person is no longer suffering. So grief changes over time, but it never goes away. That's something else that we like to bring up, because in the school system, I think a lot of times when grief counselors come in and the school says, okay, so how long are you going to talk to these kids? You have like 6 weeks, right? Well, no, I work for the whole school year and then continue with them for as long as they want in their school career, K through 12, because grief never goes away. So it changes over time, and the more that they work with it and process it, of course, it becomes easier to handle, but it never goes away. And we have to recognize that as adults, that they're not just going to be over it. So to understand how a child is going to comprehend and work with their grief, we have to also take into account their age and their developmental stage. And that's this next part of our presentation here is going to break down developmental age groups and their understandings of grief and death. So if questions come up during this part, please, again, feel free, like raise your hand or do this on the screen, and Pastor Scott will be able to see who it is, because I can't see all of you. Okay, So looking at infant to 3 years, obviously they don't understand death, but they experience it more as a separation. So they may become more detached or disinterested in what's going on around them. They might have heightened anxiety around separation. So if their mother died and their daughter or their father has to leave the home to go on errands, you might notice a more heightened anxiety coming across as temper tantrums or mood swings of that nature. You might witness more change in their play behavior. So if they're acting out more of the missing parent or missing person in their play, and that's to be expected. So working with that, we have to make sure we maintain really simple language. I like to use the example of when we say someone went away instead of someone died, or they went up to heaven. Kids take that very literally. And I've had little kids that I work with when those words have been used, like they went up to heaven and they look skyward, that they think that the next airplane trip that they go on, that they're going to reach heaven. So things that we may take for granted, they take very literally. So it's important to start at a young age with concrete language and being able to explain death in terms of no heartbeat, can't breathe, doesn't feel pain. And a really great book that I can also give information about, but I use it with all my little kids, is called When Dinosaurs Die. It's illustrated by the artist that does Arthur the Aardvark on PBS. So those of you that have children or grandchildren, a lot of the kids really relate because they're like, wait, he looks really familiar, but they're dinosaurs, not aardvarks. But the author breaks it down into really simple terms and also takes a cultural perspective to talk about different traditions, both religious and cultural aspects to death and dying and the funeral situation. So it's really nice to work with little kids. So with this younger group, again, it's also really important to try to minimize routine change because the more consistency they have, the less anxiety that they'll experience. Okay, so ages 3 to 6, death is still a temporary thought. Magical thinking is really common at this age. And magical thinking is, if I hold my breath and jump up and down, I can make X happen. And also the thought of, I was mad at mom, I yelled at her, and then she died. So then they blame themselves for the death and they think that they were responsible because of their behavior. At this age, there also might be a lot of repetitive questioning, asking more questions about death and trying to comprehend what it means, but also searching for the person because it doesn't feel permanent to them. Their understanding of death is not permanent. So they might be looking or saying, so when is daddy coming home? He must be gone for a really long time for work. But in reality, daddy died. So how can we help? Again, it's the language. Language is key here. And I always like to, when I'm talking to adults, especially in our culture, it doesn't naturally come to us to say death, dying, dead. A lot of people are very uncomfortable with using those concrete words. We tend to soften it by saying, I'm sorry for your loss. And when we really pick on the words, the definition of lost usually means you can find it again. So it can be confusing for younger children because if we lost them, well, why can't we go find them? So using the language for death, dying, and dead can be really helpful for them to understand as they're growing up. And also making sure that we're reassuring against their magical thinking. So even though you didn't clean your room and you yelled at your mom, you didn't cause her cancer. It's not your fault. And then the other thing that comes up a lot for little kids is reassuring them of some kind of care plan. So I had a little kid a number of years ago, but his one parent had died and he had concerns that his other parent was going to die. And if that happened, how was he going to go get a job and pay the bills? And he was 6. So this is a real thing. In their minds, it's not always concrete. They're worried about paying the mortgage. Kids in first grade are having those extra concerns and stresses. So we have to make sure that they understand a plan, just like we would practice a fire exit strategy in our homes or in their schools, that we let them know there is a plan. I don't plan on getting sick and dying, but if something were to happen to me, this is who would take care of you. You're not going to have to do it by yourself. Okay. So ages 6 to 9, kids generally begin to see death as final. And sometimes they can visualize death in the form of a tangible being. So they think of death as a ghost or a boogeyman, something that's a force acting upon their loved one or them. So there's a fear of death in that sense. But at the same time, they don't typically think of death as a stage of life that's going to happen to them or their family members. So it's something that should be avoidable in their mindset. We often don't go through our childhood thinking about the life cycle and about how there's a beginning, a middle, and an end. So the consequence of death is just, it's beyond our thought process. But at this stage, they're also very curious about the death, cremation, and burial rites, and often ask candid questions because they want to know more details. They're trying to piece it all together. So how we help? Again, back with the concrete language. And also normalizing death. So having these conversations, whether it's within your family or if you're teaching, to talk about those life cycles, bring it up about how there's a beginning, a middle, and an end to everything on our planet. And you can break that down into talking about plants and their regeneration cycle. You can talk about, anything. A lot of kids will experience a pet dying before they do a person dying. So talking about those things can normalize death. And then I'm an art therapist by training too. So I like to use art or play therapy or music therapy. We have a music therapist on the line, I know too. And help them have these coping tools for expressing their feelings. Role modeling is also a huge thing. So a lot of times adults feel like they have to be strong. And what do we believe that means? What does being strong mean? I think a lot of people assume being strong means you're hiding your emotions or you're not showing that you're upset. But if we're not showing these young people what it looks like to be upset when we're adults, they're not learning how to do it as children. And then they grow up to be adults that don't know how to express their feelings either. So it's really important to model that for them. Moving into the preteen years. So preteens, they usually can conceive of both the biological meaning of death and the emotional process of death. But at the same time, they still can't wrap their brains around expressing their own feelings of death. So they tend to hold it in. They might start questioning their belief systems. So if they're part of a faith community, questioning, why is this happening in my house? Why is this happening to my family? And then having more fear about what's going to happen to their other loved ones. So again, with the role modeling, it's important to encourage them to talk about their feelings. And I just lost my train of thought for a second there, but encouraging them talking about their feelings, use open-ended questions, help them identify what those feelings are that are in their bodies and in their minds. So with the death of a family member, often there's going to be changes in routine, changes in family roles. So if we can have these conversations with them so that they can understand and recognize what those changes are and how they might affect their mood, that'll go a long way into helping them learn proper coping skills. And then also recognizing that with all the changes that they're going through emotionally and with their home life, that it's probably going to take a toll on their school and academic experience. So having that conversation with the preteen about what it is they want their school advisors, their teachers, their counselors to know about their story, so that the school can provide support in both counseling and also flexibility with their schoolwork. But give the student or the preteen the power to be part of that decision, so that it's not just the family that's reaching out, but empowering them to be able to speak up and say what they want as well. And I hear one of my dogs barking. It's gonna make the other dog bark in a second, so bear with me if they start freaking out. Okay, so teens. Teens understand the concrete meaning of death and its finality, but this is a time when teens are trying to find their own way in life, right? They're striking it out on their own. They're finding their independence. So if they're going through grief at the same time, it's probably going to bring up a lot more questions about their belief systems and the injustice of it all. Sorry, my dogs are distracting me now. I'm going to close my office door. Hang on. Okay. They maintain quiet all day long when I was on the computer, and then they decide to bark when I'm on with you guys. So my apologies.
Dogs are always welcome in church.
Okay, so the other thing that's on the board there is the teens are fully capable of expressing their grief, and depending on their personality and their upbringing and you know what was modeled for them, some of them are more than open and willing to talk about it, but oftentimes they hide their feelings. And the reason why they're hiding their feelings is because they're worried that if they share it, they're going to cause suffering in others. So I have kids say to me over and over again, I can't talk about this at home because if I do, my mom's going to cry. And then I don't want to be responsible for my mom crying because I'm making her suffer. And so I oftentimes will talk about it. And you're not making her suffer. You're opening the door to allow her to share her pain that's already there. So you're giving her a platform to share with you, and that you're helping support her, not creating more pain. So that's really important. So how to help, we go back to the concrete language again and talking about, you know, what do they have control over? What can they control so they don't feel so helpless? Again, role modeling, letting them know it's okay to express all your feelings. It's okay to cry. It takes great strength to show your vulnerability. And listen. Ask open-ended questions. Don't get into those power struggles with the teenagers, and allow them to have that voice about what they need. Okay, so we're going to move in to common grief reactions that you can look for. Common grief reactions fall into 4 categories here. We have physical, emotional, mental, and social. Most of my students report having their appetite affected and their sleep patterns disturbed. And if our sleep patterns are disturbed, then everything else is a snowball effect, right? So at bedtime, when we're supposed to be getting sleep, everything else around us is getting quiet, but our brain amps up, because quieting everything else around us doesn't allow our mind to quiet. It opens the floodgates for all the thoughts that we were trying to block throughout the day. So kids are often then turning to their devices, their iPads, their phones for distraction to quiet the noise in their head. They're thinking about their loved one. They're thinking about the stress of everything going on around them. And then they're watching TikTok until 4 a.m, right? So they're not getting any sleep, which is going to affect their mood the next day. It's going to make them more irritable with their parents. It's going to put them on edge with their classmates and their friends. And when we're on edge with all of that, it heightens our anxiety. So all of these string together. It's a cyclical effect, which also thus in turn affects our mental reactions. So grief in of itself can cause shorter attention span and difficulty concentrating. But if you go back to the physical of sleep deprivation or nightmares, you're also going to have a foggy brain. Kids that I work with often report sitting in class thinking they're focusing and hearing the teacher for the whole period, and the whole hour goes by, the bell rings, and they have no idea what was said during that period. And it's because their brain and their heart were elsewhere, right? They were thinking about their loved one who died. They were thinking about the stresses their families are going through, and they're not able to concentrate. And if we have trouble regulating all of this, it's just going to snowball even more, which causes us to have more distress with our family and our friends. If we can't self-regulate, how are we going to regulate a relationship with our family and our friends? So it often, I have kids report, especially teenagers, talking about hanging out with their friends and everything's cool. And then someone says something out of the blue that triggers their anger, and they snap on them and they're yelling at their friend. And it really has nothing to do with their friend, but the friend is the reciprocating end of all their frustration and their anger that they're going through right now. So how do we support and help? First of all, for the adults on the line, I want to reiterate always that you guys already have this. You've got all the tools. There's no magic book. There's no spell, because you wouldn't be here right now if you weren't caring, and if you weren't compassionate, and if you didn't have the ability to listen. You wouldn't log on to your community talks. You wouldn't be part of your faith community. So you already have all these skills. The major thing is to find the ability to sit with discomfort and difficult emotions and be there to listen. So here's a little acronym for those of you in the teaching world. It's important to remember that, again, I've already said this several times, but to give these children the chance to advocate for themselves. But if we can acknowledge the death in a private way, if you're working with kids in schools, don't say something as they're leaving the classroom if we're not in a pandemic and there are other kids in the room, right? Because they're going to be mortified that you said anything if there were other kids within earshot. Always be genuine, listen, express your concern, and then limit personal sharing. That really goes for the adults when it's not a shared grief or a shared loss. Because there's another slide coming up, but if someone lost their mother and I say, oh yeah, I lost my mother too, that's shifting the focus from what their story is and bringing it back to what your story is. And that's not really what your intention is, but that's what it does. And it takes the energy away from what they're experiencing. If it's a shared loss, then it would make sense to say, I'm hurting so much because Frank died, and I can only imagine how you're feeling, and then joining with them because you have that shared relationship with the person who died. But otherwise, it's really important to try to limit your sharing. And this goes back to saying that a child's grief and pain is caused by the death, but not by talking about it. So to remember, it's okay to not shy away from talking about death or asking them the questions, because even if they break down, even if they start crying, you're not causing that pain. It's something that's there just under the surface. So if you are able to start that conversation and they express their emotion, they're comfortable with you. You've opened that door for them to be able to express themselves, and that's a great gift. Okay, so I want to move in a little bit to the definitions of empathy versus sympathy. I think oftentimes in our culture, we use the word sympathy more than we do empathy. And I think when it's used, people actually mean empathy and not sympathy. So empathy is understanding what others are feeling because you've experienced it, or you're trying to put yourself in their shoes. And then sympathy is more along the idea of feeling pity or sorrow. So the young people I work with will often tell me they don't want people to know what they're going through because they don't want pity. Okay, that's something they take very seriously. They do not want pity, so they don't want their teachers or their classmates to know that their parent died. And I do a lot of education then about what people's intentions are. If your teacher is reaching out to you, it's not because they pity you, it's because they want to understand what you're going through and their heart breaks that you're having to deal with this. So I have a little video clip. Some of you might be familiar with Brene Brown. It's a really short little cartoon that explains empathy and sympathy a little bit better than I probably just did. So let's see if it works and if you guys can hear it.
So what is empathy and why is it very different than sympathy? Empathy fuels connection. Sympathy drives disconnection. Empathy, it's very interesting. Teresa Wiseman is a nursing scholar who studied professions, very diverse professions where empathy is relevant, and came up with 4 qualities of empathy. Perspective taking, the ability to take the perspective of another person or recognize their perspective as their truth. Staying out of judgment, not easy when you enjoy it as much as most of us do. Recognizing emotion in other people and then communicating that. Empathy is feeling with people. And to me, I always think of empathy as this kind of sacred space when someone's kind of in a deep hole and they shout out from the bottom and they say, I'm stuck, it's dark, I'm overwhelmed. And then we look and we say, hey, you can climb down. I know what it's like down here and you're not alone. Sympathy is, ooh, it's bad, no, you want a sandwich? Empathy is a choice, and it's a vulnerable choice because in order to connect with you, I have to connect with something in myself that knows that feeling. Rarely, if ever, does an empathic response begin with at least. And we do it all the time because you know what? Someone just shared something with us that's incredibly painful, and we're trying to silver lining it. I don't think that's a verb, but I'm using it as one. We're trying to put the silver lining around it. So I had a miscarriage. Oh, at least you know you can get pregnant. I think my marriage is falling apart. At least you have a marriage. John's getting kicked out of school. At least Sarah is an A student. But one of the things we do sometimes in the face of very difficult conversations is we try to make things better. If I share something with you that's very difficult, I'd rather you say, I don't even know what to say right now. I'm just so glad you told me. Because the truth is, rarely can a response make something better. What makes something better is connection.
Okay. So I just wanted to open up if anyone on this call has a personal example of empathy versus sympathy that you've experienced in your own life. And so if there's anyone, feel free to unmute. Anybody? Okay. I don't need
like
to.
when
Okay, go ahead.
I don't it I think it happened to me. I don't know. I know it happened to some of my friends where they would tell someone, "Hey, my dog died," or like my aunt I wasn't really close to died. They'd be like, "Oh yeah, my aunt died last year too," or "My dog died there last year as well."
Okay. Yeah. So maybe they were trying to join and understand where that person was coming from. And perhaps that was their attempt to support them as well. Good example. Yeah. So like I said earlier, I think that we use the word sympathy, and what we're really doing is have an empathic response to the person who is suffering. I think I want to say that's most people's intention, is to have that empathic response. We're not pitying our friends and our neighbors as much as we do want to support them in what they're going through and trying to understand. But in the little cartoon, I think the bear said, "I can't imagine how you're feeling, but I'm here if you want to talk." And that's really important when working with young people, whether it's grief over the death of a loved one or expanding it into the larger context of what the young people are going through with the pandemic, and all the changes with their environments because of the pandemic as well, adding stress, is for the adults to remember that we can say, "I don't fully understand what you're going through, but I'm here if you want to talk about it." So, and now my keyboard doesn't want to respond. There we go. So this is the little chart I mentioned, and I don't put a lot of stock in everything about this, but it's some really simple examples about how we want to keep the focus on the person who is grieving instead of changing the focus onto our own story. So instead of saying, "Yep, I lost both my parents when I was your age," use those open-ended questions again. Tell me more about what it's been like for you, right? It's really important to give them every opportunity to share what they're going through. And young people have a tendency to like to answer in yes and no so that they don't have to talk very much. So we have to construct our questions really crafty as adults so that they're open-ended and that they don't have the opportunity just to say yes or just to say no, but to have them say more about that. So now we've covered developmental understanding of death and grief. We've covered common grief reactions and how to be supportive. But we also need to pay attention to the warning signs when grief experiences move beyond normal grief. And this is a tough one because as parents, it's not always obvious. As teachers, we might notice more behavior change in school. As peers, for the young people on this call, you might be more in tune to what your friends are doing for their recreational behavior. But there's a difference in depression, clinical and situational depression. So situational, I talk to my students often about, that's something they're all going to probably experience when they are experiencing the death of a loved one. But it becomes more clinical depression based on the timeline of how long they're experiencing these feelings. So if it's an adult recognizing this in a young person, we have to wonder, okay, how long are they experiencing these behaviors of depression? Are you aware of substance abuse? Are you aware of eating disorders? So I have the benefit of working with these young people, and they talk about all of this in group really openly, right? So then I'm able to refer them to counseling and therapy outside of the grief realm so that they can get the professional help that they need. But it's something to focus in on about, does it go beyond grief reactions? And if it is going beyond grief reactions that are normal, we need to seek more professional help. Which leads us into your own compassion fatigue if you're a caregiver. So it's my understanding, Kate told me you had someone come in recently that probably flushed this out a whole lot more. I'm just touching over the skim surface of it. But if you're a care provider, if you're a teacher, if you're a parent, we run the risk of compassion fatigue if you're dealing with sadness and sorrow and trauma day in and day out in your personal and your professional lives. So we need to learn to strike a balance to really avoid the overwhelm to your own system. So compassion is a deep sense of knowing or an awareness of the suffering of another, coupled with a wish to relieve it. So our compassion satisfaction is the pleasure derived from helping those people. And then compassion fatigue is thought to be the result of exposure to the suffering of others and listening to their trauma with little or no emotional support or method for taking care of ourselves after doing that repeatedly. So some factors that contribute again to the compassion fatigue: prolonged exposure to it, doing it over and over again, not being able to break from the memories or reliving the traumas that you're hearing about, and then having on top of all that our other life stresses. So have you ever done your own checklist to check about where your compassion fatigue is? So these are really similar to the way grief manifests. We talked about the physical, the emotional, the mental, and social. And this checklist for compassion fatigue falls into those same categories, but we need to look at how much it's escalating for us. So is it something that's manageable? It's not fun, but it's manageable. Or is it something that's causing prolonged exposure and really taking its toll on our everyday life? So just looking at some of these, if you're experiencing more anger in your life, more anxiety, feeling like you need to turn to different substances for relief, having physical pains more and more often through your day and your week. These are all symptoms of compassion fatigue. And then this slide is just talking about recognizing it in your workplace. So if you start avoiding certain people or doing certain tasks, and at the end of the day, you have no joy about doing your job, and you can't separate your work and your home life, it just doesn't shut off. And that would make you not want to go to work anymore. So those are things to recognize within yourself as well. So how do we show compassion for ourselves? I mean, we're talking about looking at children's grief, recognizing what is normal grief, how they experience death, how they understand grief, and then we want to support them. What are you doing to support yourself? Because if you burn your candle at both ends, there's not going to be anything left of you to help others. So you have to fill up your own cup, right? You have to take care of yourself in order to continue to care for others. So I'm wondering about your self-care. What are you guys doing for your own self-care? And I just made a little chart here with different categories: our physical, our emotional, our social. But I'm wondering here, and I really hope more people will unmute themselves, because I want to hear your inspirations, what you guys are doing, especially in Minnesota winters, to take care of yourself on each of these planes. Do you have the ability to say no when people ask you to do things? Creating good boundaries is part of your self-care. You know, taking time for yourself, scheduling time for yourself. Oftentimes we'll go through our day and we're like, well, I've got to get X, Y, and Z done. And if at the end of that I still have energy, maybe I can take care of myself by reading a good book or doing yoga. But we tend to not put ourselves first or schedule it into our daily practice. So I'm wondering, what are you guys doing for self-care?
Hey, Meredith, this is Karen.
Hi, Karen.
So you know Luna. So our self-care is playtime, tug of war. We have a half an hour between 5:30 and 6 while I watch the national news, and she tries to rip my arm off. And it makes me laugh and brings everything down.
Awesome. And Luna gets you out physical too. She gets you out walking every day, multiple times a day. So I know that.
Yeah, exactly.
And you're out in nature then too.
Mm-hmm. And breathing fresh, crisp air.
Yeah.
Chris.
Oh, Osa, do you have your hand up?
I would say a hobby I have is I like to paint to take my mind off things.
Awesome. Do you do oil or watercolor or acrylic?
Acrylic.
Awesome. Painting is
Thanks,
so fun.
Osa.
So I try to do all of the things that nutrition, and I walk and I work with the personal trainer, but the boundaries thing is a real problem for me because I'm retired and I have a neighbor who just broke her ankle and she can't do anything for herself. She does not have a good relationship with her parents. I'm right across the driveway, and she's continually asking me to help out. And I do. I walk her dog twice a day. I buy her groceries. I'm taking her to the surgeon tomorrow. And because I am retired, I feel give myself less permission to say no. Because what else have I got to do, you know?
Take care of yourself. That's what you've got to do. Taking care of yourself is a big job too.
But then I think, well, it could be me, and then I'm going to need her. So, you know, there'll be payback time. But I hope nothing happens to me. But it's really hard for me to say no. It always has been. And being retired, giving, you know, with the extra time, it's even worse. Even worse.
Yeah. No.
Do you need me to walk your dog too?
I'm going to mute my screen if they keep this up. They fight every once in a while. Of course, they do that right when I'm on a call. Okay, no, that's great. And you know what? You're not alone with not being able to say no. You're not alone. So it's not a bad thing, but it's something to look at about how can you prioritize yourself too, and maybe asking other neighbors, hey, you know, this neighbor, she needs our help, and we need to be a community and share responsibility. So that's good. Anyone else?
I kind of have a little bit of a opposite as you, Julie. I would say that I'm a very busy person between our family and school and work and everything. I have very little free time. So I don't, so if a friend or a family member should call me, I don't ever not answer the phone, because it's like my care for my relationships and my care for myself. It's those connections to others, because to be honest, like I don't really get to do a whole lot of connecting, especially with COVID, right? We're not all getting together. And so I just make myself take those breaks, even though it's like not good timing, right? But I make myself take those breaks so that I can connect with others. And I love it, actually.
Yeah. So you're building in the break time. Good for you.
I like to like cook and bake, because like it kind of falls into hobbies, and it kind of falls into nutrition too, because like it just kind of is like a fun way for me to like just kind of like find something to do that's good for myself and good for my spiritual well-being and like physical well-being and everything. So I really like to cook.
And I bet your family's happy for it too. So you're taking care of them because they get to eat your creations in the kitchen.
Usually I just cook for myself, because
whenever you're not sharing with them. They can make their own food.
Well, I like to bake for them, but usually I just cook myself lunch.
Okay, good deal.
Thanks, Evelyn. Kara, did I see your hand up there? No, maybe?
Oh, no. Oh, you did. Sorry, I was just bad with technology here. Yeah, Jack wanted to share his cat. That's how he playing with his cat. So I'm not sure if everybody can see it, but yeah, sometimes she wants to play and sometimes she just wants to rest, but that's part of his self-care.
Well, and I would say the cat even falls into the therapy realm, because our animals are our best therapists, because they don't talk back, they just listen.
Right.
So they're great therapy. Unless they're fighting like mine, because they didn't like the other one was next to me. So, okay. So no more self-care tips from the crew here. Okay. Well, I only have one more slide, and that, if my computer will behave, is that if you don't make time for your wellness, you'll be forced to make time for your illness. And so that was a meme that was circulating the web a year ago, and I searched high and low for the source, but you can't, no one's claiming ownership of that statement. But I think it's really important through helping young people and helping yourself that we remember that we want to provide the support for the young people in our world. But truthfully, we need to know how to take care of ourselves first to be able to be those role models for the young people. And if we can model, good self-care and good self-love, that there'll be more of that for the younger generations to learn to know how to do. So that is really all that I have. And I went through that much faster than I had practiced earlier. But I know that there are some questions. I'm going to stop presenting my screen there. That I think Kay has a list of questions, and if anybody else has some spontaneous questions.
Yeah, first I'll open it up. Questions, anyone?
I have a
Yeah,
question. I have a
go
question.
ahead.
Meredith, maybe you could just touch on, and I my guess is most of what you just talked to us about grief, you referred mainly to death. And I'm guessing that a lot of this is also going to be, I think, because we're all in this COVID and this word ambiguous loss. And I'm thinking all of us have had losses because of COVID that aren't necessarily death related. They certainly could be. But I'm also thinking especially of the kids, and just because of mental health in children and adolescents and young adults is really skyrocketing. And I suspect it is a lot around the losses that many of them experienced with not going to school in person, not having activities, maybe having illness in their family or death. Is there anything particular you would say about that? Or I suspect a lot of what you just shared also pertains to that. And it's maybe what we're going to just have to be aware of. But I just would love to hear a little bit about that.
Yeah, sure. Well, an ambiguous grief and loss, recognizing that it's things that we can't have closure about, right? You can't control the pandemic and what you're missing out on and the activities like you just listed. So I think, again, how best to support the young people through their loss of what was normal prior to the pandemic, again, is just keeping those channels of communication open and really modeling for them and your families. Being able to express what your frustrations are to a certain extent is going to help them be able to express what their frustrations are. Encouraging self-expression through their frustrations. So we have the painter on the call, being able to tap into their hobbies and their creativities to help hone in the coping skills. So I didn't get into coping skills today in as much, but in my practice, we spend the majority of our time teaching healthy coping skills versus what their negative coping skills are. And I think those can really be extrapolated to what we're dealing with the pandemic. So recognizing in yourself with the self-care, those are all coping skills. So if you can make a plan and recognize, hey, I have these 5 ideas for my self-care and these are my coping skills, then it's your toolbox and you can go back to them. So having maybe a family conversation with the young people and really brainstorming together, what are our coping skills? When you're feeling overwhelmed, when you're feeling frustrated because you spent all day on Google Meets and Google crashed and you couldn't hear but every other syllable and you have no idea what's going on in chemistry then. So what are your coping skills for that today? And encourage them to be able to come home and talk about that. I think another thing, well, an example, and I meant to say more personal examples with my students, and then I get nervous talking, so I start babbling really fast. But I had a young lady this week even, she's a 3rd grader, and we were talking about dealing with the stress of being back in the building because the elementary schools are back in most districts with a full building, and the anxiety that comes up and what we do when we feel that stress and anxiety and come home. And she's on a call with another 3rd grader. And the other 3rd grader said, well, I come home and I cuddle with my mom and we just spend the afternoon cuddling and I can't get her to stop. But the first 3rd grader said, well, I can't, my mom won't do that. She's on her phone all the time. So you have a 3rd grader recognizing my mom is too invested in her devices. She doesn't cuddle me. And that's what she needs. So if we can have conversations and welcome our children to tell us that they're recognizing that maybe our default for managing our stress is to be in our screens too. If she felt like she could say that to her mom, I mean, what world would that open up? Because I know this mother, she doesn't mean to be avoiding her child, right? But we want that child to feel comfortable to say, hey, mom, can you put your phone down for a while? I'm really overwhelmed. Can we talk about it? So just really opening up those channels of communication, I think, is dealing with a lot of that ambiguous loss and grief. The other thing I think, Jody, that comes up a lot about that right now is when parents are focusing on, well, my kid is missing out on X, Y, and Z, is oftentimes the kids don't know what they're missing out on because they haven't experienced it yet. So we as adults are doing a lot of projection about and sadness about what they're missing out on. But if we're not talking about it, the child isn't experiencing it the same way that we are, because we did have the opportunity to experience that. So being able to reframe it as well. I mean, I spend a lot of time talking to kids about how they're leaps ahead of any other generation with technology now. They were already great at being IT people, but now they know how to do all their classes online, and they're having FaceTime with their friends, and they're doing Netflix watch parties. Like, we wouldn't have thought of this a year ago, right? So although they might not be in school in person in the way we want them to be, they are experiencing so many other things and can be gaining so many other lessons from the struggles we're going through. So.
I wanted to ask you too about getting back to school, because, there might be in some cases real phobia to go back. I mean, kids have become comfortable at home.
Yeah.
A parent is working in the next room, and they, so they may have some real phobia about that. There might be some real anxiety about being masked all day. How am I going to do that? And I got behind. When I get back to school, I used to be one of the best math students, and I might really be behind. So I just want the kids to know, there are many. You've had a lot of successes technically and all that other stuff. And I know there are worries, and I just want you to know, teachers and other staff in the school, they really want to help you out on that. So Meredith, do you have anything to say about that?
Well, definitely. I mean, I know firsthand there are some anxieties. There's also a lot of joy. I was speaking to kids today that are back seeing, half their cohort in school, and there's excitement, but fear at the same time. And you're absolutely right. The teachers want to support the kids as much as possible. The teachers are still going through a lot of challenges, because even if schools have the opportunity back full time, there's still, several families that are choosing the full distance learning model. And then the teachers are trying to do both at the same time in some districts. They don't all have all the districts don't have the benefit to have two different teaching staffs. So there are all those challenges, but I mean, I frame it as you're not behind the rest of your classmates because all your classmates were in the same boat you were. So what standards are we putting on them to say they're behind when, I mean, our whole world is going through this. We're not singled out. So you just have to encourage them to know they're doing the best that they can, and we'll proceed from there.
Evelyn, did you have a question?
Like, have you like studied or like noticed any changes from like childhood grief when children like become adults? Does it like show up again in a either more major or more minor?
Really good question. Yeah, it really depends on how much the children, if they had someone die when they were little, it depends on how much support and the opportunity they had to process their grief. Because I used to also, prior to this incarnation of my work life, work with the elderly population. And you would find stories of people who were dying, and they were just then dealing with their grief from their childhood because they never had the opportunity to process the death of their loved one when they were little. And they held it, inside for so long that it wasn't until they were dying that they reached that. But more to your question. So if the kids I'm working with are going through grief counseling and they're talking and they're learning these coping skills, I think it's a roller coaster effect of how grief shows up in our life, but hopefully they've learned a lot of the skills on how to manage it. So it's hopefully not going to come back and smack them in the face, Evelyn, because they're learning the skills to manage it, right? But it's an ever-changing roller coaster. So we have good days and we have bad days.
Meredith, if I'm the parent of, school age kids, especially, other than, talking about it, what other things would you look for to see, like for COVID grief?
For
what kind
COVID,
of-
for the ambiguous grief?
Yeah, would it be the same as, you listed things you'd see in grief in different age groups in your slides? Are
Yeah.
those the same with COVID grief?
Well, I would probably look at marked changes in behavior. So if you knew them to behave a certain way prior to the pandemic hitting us, and all of a sudden they're doing something to an opposite extreme, a lot of times we'll use an example of like the average kid, and all of a sudden they're misbehaving, or all of a sudden they're being the angelic child that doesn't want to upset anybody. Looking at those extremes in behavior, looking at how much they're isolating. I have students who, one today, so I can speak from present moment. She's a very social young lady, but she said she doesn't want to leave her bedroom. She's, back in school hybrid style this week, but the rest of the week she's not opening her bedroom door. She's not eating, she's not going to the family dinners. She's just eating whatever junk food is squirreled away. So if you're recognizing the changes in behavior, then definitely that's when you want to open up the conversation and see if there's more that can be done. And if you're really concerned, Kay, being able to get them a depression screening so that they can have more clinical help to support them through their challenges.
Good, thanks. Gretchen? Yep.
Hi, Gretchen.
Hi, Meredith. I was just wondering about rituals. And maybe using some rituals like for this ambiguous grief. It's sometimes easier, I think, with death. There's more formal rituals in place. Yeah. But do you have thoughts about that?
Well, what are your thoughts, Miss Gretchen?
Well, I heard a talk once about even just a made up simple ritual. Like I know when my kids' elementary school closed, everybody drew a flower on a piece of paper. So kind of putting something into a creative outlet, or just to say, here's for how I feel today, and everybody draw something, or I don't know.
No, absolutely. Side plug, I'm on this board for something called Ziggy's Art Bus, but it's a nonprofit that works with children and their families who are suffering chronic illness or are in hospice care, and they're doing art. But we were talking the other night about some projects for the community at large, to be able to purchase and participate in as a fundraiser to support Ziggy's. And the idea, Gretchen, because Gretchen and I are colleagues, by the way, so full disclosure here, but we do memory boxes in grief group oftentimes so that kids each week can add something about their loved one. But I was putting that kind of on a twist for a ritual, Gretchen, and making it a time capsule for families, because not all families are experiencing grief over a loved one's death. So maybe with the pandemic, if you wanted a ritual as a family practice, is going to Michael's or ordering in from Amazon a little, balsam wood box, and being able to add things about the family's strengths, what gives us strength, what gives us courage in these uncertain times. And then you can create a creative ritual around that. And at the end of it all, you'd have everyone's thoughts and feelings in a box that you can review when you're 50 years old. So it's kind of fun.
Nice. I love that. I see we've passed our 7:30 mark. So I really appreciate your insight and your help as we try to maneuver or work through grief during this time. Just so grateful for you sharing your expertise with us. And thanks to everybody who came tonight and for your questions. And yeah, anything else, Meredith?
No, I just encourage you, your community, because I know you're a tight-knit community, is to continue the conversations about different ways to do self-care throughout the year. As Minnesotans, we need to be creative when it's colder about our outdoor activities, but what fun ways. I also go dance around your living rooms tonight, pump your favorite music and have a little dance party. That counts as physical activity and joy making. So
yeah,
do something that brings you joy, no matter how silly it is.
Yeah, I think we're about to end our period where we're going to need to test the indoor joy over the outdoor joy, right?
Yeah.
The less frozen option.
And even dancing in your chairs, you don't have to be on your feet, For those of us that are mobily limited, you can wiggle around in your couch or your chair and dance.
Yeah, good. All right. Well, thanks again. And with that, I will say good night.
Good night, everybody.